Thank you for joining Once Changing the World. I'm your host, Eddie Abel, and today I have with us Dr. Nikhilesh Nataraj, a trailblazing neuroscientist at UCSF who's restoring movement to paralyzed patients through thoughts alone. Learn what paralysis is, the causes and types of paralysis, and how a stroke patient controlled a robotic arm for 7 months using just their thoughts. You'll also learn about the different types of brain-computer interfaces, both invasive as well as non-invasive brain-computer interfaces, and how they are transforming healthcare and the surprising role of neuroplasticity in long-term robotic control. Dr. Nataraj also unpacked how adaptive AI algorithms decode noisy brain signals without constant recalibration. He also spoke about the ethics of neurotechnology and the future breakthroughs that could map the entire human brain, both structurally and functionally, and eventually would be able to maybe augment healthy humans too. He spoke about promising peers in the stem cell and exoskeleton space, the impact of sleep on BCI adaptation, plus a vision for a wheelchair-free future. Stay tuned for this exciting episode. Really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. Wanted to start with, your interest. What was that spark that kind of, caught you into deep diving into paralysis and the field of neural engineering? And could you walk us through your understanding of paralysis, its main causes and the different types you encounter in both your research and clinical settings?
Well, first of all, thank you, Eddie, for having me. It's truly an honor, and I look forward to talking with you. And my background is actually engineering, so I studied electrical engineering at College of Engineering Gindi in Anna University here in Chennai. Before that, I was mainly an athlete, tennis player, and track athlete, and just incidental that once my sports career fizzled out, I took up the books and every Indian kid, you have no choice but to be an engineer or a doctor, at least the time I was growing up. One of the inspirations for me to pursue neuroscience while I was taking a bunch of courses was this talk by this Indian American person, V.S. Ramachandran. So I saw his talk, and he was presented the brain and its mysteries in such a fascinating manner. I was just blown away completely. Then I read his book. Then I came across, the phantom hand delusion and essentially, how our vision systems work, how our brain can fool itself into thinking so many things. And I was hooked from that. And so initially, I just studied, how the brain activity works in healthy participants. So my PhD research at Georgia Tech in the US was basically trying to understand brain activity patterns and eye movements in healthy participants, very similar to what V.S. Ramachandran did. But then when I finished my PhD, I really wanted to translate these basic findings for real world application, right? I think I was doing a lot of pure research, but I also wanted to do translational research. And in terms of translational research, at that point of time, again, BCIs, brain computer interfaces, was really taking off, which was essentially taking basic science understanding of the brain and using it to improve lost function in patients with paralysis. And so that was my journey, a little bit unconventional, but then I moved to San Francisco and I started work on BCIs, and that's how my journey essentially began.
Right. So, Doctor, will we appreciate if you can kind of, give us an understanding of what paralysis is, the causes, and the different type of paralysis?
Yeah. So I think there are many types of paralysis. There are sensory deficits. For example, blindness is a type of paralysis where your vision is completely gone. And then there are motor paralysis where you're not able to actually control any type of movement itself. So I think I'm focused more on motor paralysis. And this can be caused, unfortunately, for any number of reasons. But the most common causes are stroke. So if there is a stroke in the brain, anywhere in the brain, or if there's a stroke along the spinal cord near the neck, essentially what happens is that the signals that go from the brain to our extremities, that signal is cut. So the minute that signal is cut, we are no longer able to actually move our limbs, even though the thought is preserved. So a typical stroke subject who has movement deficits, what we find is that their intention to move is actually pretty well established and is preserved. But actions which go from the brain to the body, those are either damaged completely or really deteriorated to the point where even though they have the intention to move, the signal is not being carried to the end effector. So they're not able to actually move their hand at all.
Appreciate you running us through your journey, from an athlete to an engineer. And like you mentioned, I mean, I think the world has completely changed, specifically India. And you mentioned that, your growing years, I mean, obviously, I think the family is kind of pushed in a specific direction, whether it was an engineer or doctor. But I think the world is changing, and so is India. And I think India is understanding that, I mean, the traditional ways of education, or the expected jobs are also completely changing. We don't even know what the future of jobs are going to be in the next possibly 5, 10 years. Maybe where these artificial intelligence is transitioning from narrow intelligence to possibly general purpose intelligence, and maybe even at this point in time, these AI models are able to do pretty much anything and everything. And what would the world look like in the next 10 years, when they started kind of eating up our jobs. So I think the future looks, I mean, exciting, because AI can completely upend our world, and it also looks scary. And you also spoke about Dr. VS Ramachandran. I think he's an inspiration. I've been trying to pull him and get him on the on the podcast. And yes, I mean, to your specific work, with translational research, with brain computer interfaces. I've had a couple of conversations who are fronting, brain computer interfaces, both invasive as well as non-invasive. But I'm sure there'll be like fresh listeners at this point of time who wouldn't kind of have an understanding of what a brain computer interface is. So it will be great if you could kind of update the audience on what a brain computer interface is, both invasive as well as non-invasive, its pros and its cons, and what's going to do in the next 5 to 10 years, when it all comes together in the future of healthcare.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, yeah, so I think brain computer interfaces or BCIs, it's just a simple technology that where we can interface with the environment directly with our thoughts alone. And I think that in a nutshell probably defines it. So for example, if I have to interact with the phone, I speak into it. So my speech is the medium by which I interact with of communication technology. And so in the similar analogy, BCIs, the interaction is completely through thoughts. And that's a little bit scary. And, like we are going into a little bit science fiction type. But that being said, it has tremendous applications for, you know, patients who are in the clinical setting. And so these are the patients who benefit most by invasive technologies. So if you have to measure thoughts, if you have to interface with technology using thoughts, like how do we measure those thoughts? So we need those sensors. And in invasive technologies, those sensors are essentially placed inside the skull itself. So it involves a surgery where a neurosurgeon carefully opens the skull up. It's a pretty detailed surgery and then places electronic sensors either directly on the brain or even piercing brain tissue itself. And so it's an invasive procedure because you have a surgery, your skull is opened up, stitched back again. Then once everything is closed, it's kind of crazy. You have like a USB port sticking out of your skull, and we just plug it into a recording device, a computer in general, and then we read out your thoughts in real time and decode what it is that you're actually trying to think, and that becomes a medium of communicate or interfacing with the environment. Non-invasive, of course, you don't have to do that surgery. There's a lot of off-the-shelf recording hardware and sensors where we can place those sensors directly on the top of the skull without having to open it up. And we can still get some sense of what those thought patterns might be. Of course, the deeper you go into the brain, the more accurate the fidelity of the recording increases. There's a lot more you can do. Once you place it on the skull, then your signal to noise ratio or the amount of true signal that you're able to measure, it reduces a little bit. But that's for commercial purposes, non-invasive is the future. So I think there's been a huge boom in BCIs because, as you said, we are getting better and better more in the sensor technology itself. The hardware is becoming better. A lot of people have worked on the software side, especially the machine learning AI part. That's also gotten better. So it's like an inflection point where this field has been slowly growing for a very long time, and now it's like rising up pretty steep. And I mean, I think people started this like 40, 50 years ago, putting something inside a rat or a monkey. And we have come a long way since then.
Right. Yeah, yeah. So very interesting. We are kind of, probing into the black box, the human brain, like AI is a black box. I mean, it's doing so many awesome things, but it still is a black box because we don't really understand what's happening under the hood. And the same is with this human brain, 80 billion neurons, 100 trillion synapses, the way they fire and wire brings about all the five senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, and taste. And here we have like an interface between the brain and a computer, maybe like a two-way communication could like really upend the future. And I think maybe Elon Musk is like kind of pursuing this path, and it's not just his company Neuralink, there's Synchron, there's so many other brain computer interfaces startups, both which is invasive as well as non-invasive. And I think Elon is pursuing it in an approach where he thinks that the future where AI is going to get more and more potent and more powerful, a human would need to augment itself. So it's not just about right now he's dealing with healthcare, blind sight, reversing blindness and stuff like that. But I think his larger end goal is to kind of augment a human, and that like you mentioned, that gets like really really awesome because we will have like a communication between the yourself and the computer. And if we can have the entire the resource of the internet, I mean, I'm sure we'll get into the world of the matrices where at a click you'll be able to kind of download anything and everything, like how Trinity does, in the helicopter scene. She gets in the helicopter and she dials up, okay, I want to kind of understand, to try, ride this helicopter, and voila, it just gets downloaded. So yes, I think the future becomes very very potential as well as scary, like where are we kind of heading. But I think we humans are forever kind of I mean, poking onto these things and asking questions, and I think we need to keep on asking these questions, and how we kind of use these tools to you know I mean, with the current paradigm of healthcare, and how do we kind of change it? Because I think today I think there's, I think 3 billion plus people who are afflicted with neurological disorders, and and these movement paralysis. If we have something which can you know solve the problem, what a world that would be. Now your recent paper has been doing the headlines. Can you share more details about the study and the story of the paralyzed stroke patient who controlled a robotic arm for 7 months?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think, yeah, I mean, just before going to that, I think it's you raise an interesting point of the metrics, right? So I think I just wanna talk about that for 1 second. It is, I think, to any, I think this, it is definitely going to a point where I think even something like that, which felt like sci-fi before, is possible, because people are actually discovering how to write or send signals into the brain. Like I was talking about how you can decode thoughts. The next question is, okay, can we actually implant thoughts? And of course, that's a little bit far fetched, but in certain cases, you can actually send electrical signals into the brain, which actually can code up movement patterns itself. And again, this is most evident in people who've lost motor functions because of brain damage. And so when you have those brain damage, you can actually send in certain pulses which actually help recover movement. So you're almost like coding the person how to move again. So it's kind of crazy. So I mean, the future is very bright. And in terms of my recent paper which came out, so that's a project that's actually been going on for the last 3 to 4 years. And this is a participant. I had to give a little bit of background about the subject themselves. So I mean, this subject is it's a young male. He's only in his late 30s, early 40s. Unfortunately, in a car accident, he had a stroke in his brainstem about 2 decades ago. And ever since then, he's been wheelchair bound, and he has absolutely no movement capabilities, of his, entire body. He has a little bit of head movement, but most of his body is like completely paralyzed. So he's in a wheelchair, and he requires a lot of assistance. Communication is difficult, movement is out of the question. And this person is based in California. And for the longest time, for this person, this participant, his goal was really to get some level of independence, right? So it's sort of constantly waiting for someone to come and do the simplest task, as to pick up a cup or put a spoon in my mouth. Is there a way that I can actually do this myself? And essentially what we're trying to do is to bypass the broken circuits. Because he has a brainstem stroke, the signals which come from the brain to his arm, those are cut. But the intention to move is pretty well preserved. So our goal was to say, okay, well, let's forget the stroke area, but can we directly tap into the intention of to move, bypass the entire spinal circuitry and take it straight to a robotic arm? And so that was our overall, kind of goal. And yeah, if we had to like uncover a lot of foundational principles, for example, I think the biggest challenge for us was to first understand in paralyzed people, how is their thought process compared to like normal, in the sense that healthy people don't have the inability to move. Like when we move our hands and legs, the crucial thing is that we get instant feedback. So I have an intention to move and I move, and I can immediately see how my arm is moving. I can get the sensation of how my arm is moving. So my brain is getting this feedback constantly of my intention. And that actually we find is very useful for the brain to be in this really nice control state. It's able to accurately kind of control its movements. In paralyzed individuals, they don't get this feedback. So they have the intention to move, but because they're not able to move, there is no feedback on what the intention is. And what we find is that because of this lack of feedback, their control state in their brain keeps drifting around all over the place. Ours is like very tight, you can think of it being in a very tight sphere. So our thought process is constrained because we get the feedback to kind of constrain it. But in a paralyzed individual, it's very noisy and it's drifting all over the place. So I think that was our first key insight, because we found that, this participant could not control the robot in a very stable fashion because the intention was so noisy and drifty that day to day there was like a lot of errors. It took a lot of time for them to learn. So we stepped back and said, okay, maybe we should try to like constrain their intention. So the only way to do that is to understand how their brain activity in that sphere, how it drifts day to day, what is its noise properties, and what type of feedback can we give. So, and I think that was the key realization. So for this participant, we actually did not start with the robot. We just went into a virtual environment. So we created this virtual environment where he was controlling a virtual robot in the computer screen. And then, his thought process, we were able to give feedback immediately in the virtual environment through some interactive methods. So he was getting real-time feedback just by looking at the virtual environment and the robot moving around. So once he got that feedback and once we tracked his, drift across days, then we were able to train him to almost become like a healthy participant where he, when we move, we get feedback, we become tightly constrained in our control scheme. So once that happened, and that took about 10 days to 2 weeks, then he was able to control the real robot in a very, robust manner. And then we had to slowly increase the complexity. So it's almost like if I was learning a piano from the very beginning. It's a little bit noisy and all over the place, but step by step, I can keep getting better and better. And it was the same process for him. So at the end of 7 months, he was able to control it, robustly without any training from us. He was able to pick up objects. And it started from that early characterization and a lot of practice from his side.
Right. How awesome is that? Was there any specific learnings, about neuroplasticity or how the human brain's adaptability that caught your attention? And what were you using? Was this like an invasive BCI? Was it like a non-invasive BCI? And you mentioned them. The main problem was the drift. So it will be great if you kind of maybe further elaborate on this. How did you manage to control that? Like the brain's noisy signal and narrowing it down to where it actually the thought becomes more cleaner and precise from. To convert it into the action potential of the robot.
Yeah. So I think this was definitely an invasive device. So this person did happen to have a neurosurgery, and his skull was opened up, and then we placed sensors directly on the brain tissue itself. And so it did not pierce the brain, but it was like, you had to open it up, open the skull up, and put the sensors on the brain. And these sensors were placed on the area of the brain that controls movement. so along the motor cortex. And I don't think, if you'd used a non-invasive method, I don't think we would have got as astounding a result. The invasive procedure, it does have much better fidelity. But like if I train an AI model to look for a certain pattern, yeah, it might work well on that one day. But when it comes back the next day, it will look in that specific space and find that that thought process has gone. It's no longer in that area where I trained it to look for. So then the AI model essentially then has to say, okay, the brain in this paralyzed patient's case, the brain is drifting. So I cannot come back every day and reliably look for this thought process in a certain part of the room. But is there a pattern in which the brain drifts? So if I just simply say day to day, what is, let me just scan the area, scan the room to see how that thought pattern is drifting. Can I then predict on the 11th day where it might potentially be? So it turns out that even our drift is not like completely random, that yes, it might be drifting day to day, but actually, if you start tracking it, you can start predicting where it might be the next day with some level of certainty. Of course, the more days you track, the better your prediction. It's literally like, if there is a star going across the sky, you know, day to day, if I keep tracking its location, the more I track, maybe I get better in predicting where it might be tomorrow or day after. So we had to like take a step back and say that, okay, because of this drift, our AI models work good on a single day, but it doesn't work well across day, it doesn't generalize. So we had to step back and train the AI models to actually track that drift across days. So it had to be very intelligent to essentially identify a pattern and then see where that pattern is in the entire space, in the room, the next day, the day after. And as it gets more and more data, it becomes better. So that was the key for generalization. And we found that 10 to 15 days was sufficient. After 10 to 15 days, you're able to get a pretty good estimate of where the brain activity is going to be. And the most fascinating part is what the subject also realized what was happening. So the participant also realized that, oh, okay, I'm drifting. You're trying to track me. Let me make your life easier and try to be in a place where you can easily find me. So it's like this two-way co-adaptive system where he started adapting to us and we were adapting to him. And at the end of 2 weeks, we came to like equilibrium where we knew where he was going to be. And he said, okay, I've learned to be in a place where you can find me. So, that was the.
You mentioned obviously that the data is like a big role. It plays a big role over here for the patient. Will the individuals user data that you have kind of collected, would it generalize to other people? That's my first question. And second question is, from the DNA to the RNA to the proteins, we've kind of mapped the entire genome code. Do you think that we will be able to kind of map the entire human brain structurally and functionally? And what would it take to get there where we are able to kind of completely structurally and functionally map the human brain? Because I mean, if we do that, then we have the entire, like how we've kind of mapped out the entire human genome code. If we are able to do that, I'm sure there is so much we could do in the space of neurological disease and healthcare.
Yeah. So I think to your first question, can we use data from one participant? 100% you can do. So I think that's, it's called transfer learning, where whatever we learn from one participant, we can use it on another participant, and that actually speeds up the time. So because most of our brains generally work the same with small minor differences. And so because of that, we can actually transfer data from one participant to another. And then you have to fine tune the algorithm or the methods a little bit so that it becomes more participant specific. There's been some really great work recently which has shown that with this type of transfer learning, you can actually reduce adoption times of BCI technology. What might for a single participant may take many weeks. Because of transfer learning, for subsequent participants, it takes shorter and shorter time. I think that definitely is the case. In terms of mapping the brain, so there are two challenges. One is what is the scale at which you're mapping? And then the second is trying to understand function from that mapping. So the more complex the brain, the harder the mapping is. So I think in less evolved brains like, flies and mice, I think now that mapping is almost complete, very similar to how you mentioned about sequencing the entire, DNA sequence, genome. So I think for lesser involved, I mean, at least subspecies of animals, we've already reached that point. For humans, it is a little bit more tricky, just because the complexity of our wiring is like intense. And so that's why the scale comes in. Now, I think with fMRI, your magnetic resonance imaging studies, where we can measure, brain activity and connections between brain activity, I think they've made tremendous progress. There's something called the Allen Brain Institute in University of Washington in Seattle, and there they have like the Human Brain Atlas, almost similar to the Human Genome Project, and they have made tremendous advances, at least using MRI as a modality to map out that structural component of the brain. And of course, as you collect more and more data, you can also start making functional predictions, right? There's some structure of the brain. How does it, connect to function? But this is still at a macro scale, because using MRI as a technology or any type of sensory measurements, you cannot find out what individual neurons are doing. So that is the second challenge. And I think that is incredibly hard. As you know, there are like so many synapses, like billions and trillions of synapses, 100 billion neurons in the brain. Is it possible to track what every single neuron is doing and how they're communicating to everything else? I think that is a little bit still, we are so far away from that. I think at best now, I think that number is, I think, in a few thousand. I think given, maybe like 4,000, 5,000 neurons, we can track exactly what every single neuron is doing and how they communicate with everybody else. But from that, in that scale, how do we go up to the billions, right? So I think that we are still so far away. And if that day comes, I think, we, I don't know, that would be the greatest day, probably holy grail, right? We know exactly what the brain is doing, but at least at a much higher scale, where we look at the brain as an overall system, then I think we have definitely made a lot of progress in that area.
Will be great if you could maybe talk about one quality which you think maybe like really added in the patient's life.
Yeah. So I think right now what the patient is doing is actually they're using more AI. So I think initially it was more like neuroscience heavy, trying to understand how the brain works, and then map out a nice algorithm to decode intention to move. Say and this participant is going into a grocery shop, and is a participant in a wheelchair with a robotic arm mounted. So now there is so many options, right? You have like 10 different options just to pick out what you want. So now actually we're trying to augment AI to it. In a sense, we're putting a camera at the edge of the robot. And now we're using more traditional machine learning or artificial intelligence, where the camera is actually scanning the environment. It is making a list of objects, and so we've made tremendous progress in AI these days in type of object recognition, segmentation. Like if you take any picture on your phone and you feed it to any photo editing software, it's able to tell exactly what it is, where it is. So we're using the AI also now. So before it was all completely under his brain control, but now we're going into something called shared autonomy. So in this concept of shared autonomy, the robot is controlled partially by the brain, but the robot is also being treated as an autonomous agent, almost like a self-driving car. So it has its own type of internal drive to go and select and do things in the environment. And the user then becomes more of a guiding role. So this we find actually helps the participant to navigate extremely cluttered environments. And I think this is it'll be very challenging cognitively for him to constantly keep trying to control the robot every millisecond in a very crowded environment. But the shared autonomy framework we have found has been super beneficial to him to navigate complex environments and pick out objects that he really wants to. Because a robot itself now is an autonomous agent. So it's like this merger between the robot and the human.
So just recently, I saw this fantastic video on Instagram. There's this lady, I believe her name is Jessica Tavel, and I'm assuming she was from Lebanon, and for the last 10 years she's been confined to a bed because she got paralysis, and they got this exoskeleton. And through this exoskeleton, she was able to take a first step and actually walk. And what a fantastic moment that was. And it's gone viral on the internet. And I hope that that kind of technology is more accessible and affordable for everyone. Then there is this Mayo Clinic, which is working on regenerative medicine through stem cell research, and I'm sure there's others who are working on possibly reversing paralysis. Is there any specific work in your field or the peers, working on paralysis research or neurotechnology that has caught your attention, and you think that it's extremely promising and could play a role in one day possibly reversing paralysis?
Yeah. So I think in this type of upper extremity, paralysis, I think right now, again, we're at an inflection point because, not just our results, but some other results from other groups in the world have shown that this is possible, right? Of course, we are at a research institute. So we just provide, the proof of concept that this can work. But I think now there are so many companies. As you said, there is Neuralink, there is Synchron. I know in Neuralink, they already have somebody with a robotic arm set up, right? So, and we have already shown proof of concept. We've shown us how to get stability, and we're also showing how to like use shared autonomy, where the robot becomes an autonomous agent. So, I think it might be a matter of time, just a few months, where these tech, startup companies like your Neuralinks, your Synchron, and then there is BlackRock. There are so many of these companies which already are doing these, taking our findings and making it even more robust. I think once they show that it's possible in an industrial setting, then I think it opens the door up because right now, we all have to, in the US at least, navigate through the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. So these BCIs, especially with the robotic arm, comes under, a research type of product. So to become a commercial product, these companies have to show that, yeah, it works now not just on 3 or 4 people, but it works on like 20 people, right? They have the resources to kind of pull it off. And once they show that, then they can apply for a full commercial license. I think once that happens, I'm very optimistic that in the next 3 to 4 years, this might become, actual day to day technology that gets deployed. And, you know, I can also say that China is also seeing its potential. Like there has been more and more amazing work that is coming out of, some of the top Chinese institutes for invasive BCIs, where they're also like pushing the boundaries on what is possible in terms of the cutting edge research with invasive BCIs with paralysis. And so I think, these two countries compete along with a few European institutes. Yeah, I think 4 or 5 years, this might become, mainstream. So,
Right. Yeah. How cool would that be, in a world where these, the patients who are stuck to their beds or wheelchair are finally able to, take that, step forward independently. That would be like would be the most major challenges according to you, to kind of, to make it accessible, the price points, what do you think are the, like the most major challenges over here?
so I think it depends in a very country specific manner. So uh, I think in more developed countries, probably patient care and surgery becomes, very expensive. uh, as opposed to like the hardware and software itself, right? For example, if you're able to commercialize it, immediately the hardware and software values it deteriorate really fast, and those become very cheap. But then the patient care and surgery, I mean, that is still quite expensive, right? So I think um, I think that might be the challenge. Unclear how these companies are going to tackle that moving forward. Maybe they might rely on insurance, right? Maybe if the insurance through the medical system identify that this patient's life is going to be significantly improved through a BCI, could be any BCI, it could be a speech BCI or walking BCI or like upper extremity robot BCI. But if the institution and the insurance companies make that decision, then the cost of surgery is also covered, right? Then things start becoming very, very cheap. I think it'll be interesting to see how, from a regulatory environment, how these things get navigated.
Beyond restoring lost functions, what role do you foresee for these brain computer interfaces in enhancing broader human capabilities? Are we looking at a future where brain computer interfaces could augment even healthy individuals?
Yeah, so I think that is going to be huge, especially in terms of non-invasive BCIs. I think there is so many applications which we're barely scratching the surface, right? So, for example, in if we constrain the domain that we are targeting to be very, very specific, then we can actually get away with a non-invasive BCI. So I think a lot of people are actually showing this that even for highly paralyzed patients, if we constrain the domain in which that participant is working, for example, only grasping. So we don't control the entire arm, but we control only the grasping portions. Then we actually find out that we can actually do pretty well with a non-invasive BCI. Now you can imagine that this can be expandable to anything, right? So I might be a working professional and I might be, going having a 9 to 5 job. And I find at the end of my shift at 5 o'clock, my brain is fried. So I might be like, I really just need some way to refresh my brain. This is where a BCI can come in, a non invasive commercial BCI can come in, where we can design a very domain specific application. Say that, okay, this BCI's only job is to take this tired person's brain and put him in some type of BCI environment where at the end of 20 minutes, he or she feels fresh again. So then this becomes like immediately commercially viable, right? So this could be an athlete saying that, okay, I want to, improve my focus when I do my particular sport. Okay, I'm going to the gym, I'm becoming mentally, physically stronger, I'm playing my sport, my skill set is improving. Now, how do I become mentally stronger? So now it becomes very domain specific. So we can actually design non invasive BCIs which help improve or augment in very targeted, narrow areas. So I think this is a very low hanging fruit, which I think can be a next big boon. And this, I think, any country, especially India with so much talent, and as you said, we have, these days people so much engineering skills, so many type of jobs opportunities available, and people are really exploring everything. This can be a huge thing where India can hit the ground running, no problem at all.
Right. Yeah. Especially in a world today, when there's a digital overloads of sorts, you need to funnel things which actually kind of helps, and if you have like a domain specific BCI which kind of helps you in a domain, I think it'll really, really be cool. I mean, whether for, normal humans or, otherwise, So, are there any upcoming research goals, that you're working on that, you could talk about? And Doctor, do you have like an intuit, like, I mean, the kind of work and research that you're doing? I mean, if from the research, if you had to kind of go to the lab, what would be the kind of product that you have in mind, which you would want to kind of push forward?
Yeah, so I think me personally, over the years, I'm getting more and more biased towards commercial non-invasive BCIs because I think the time to market, especially if you want to get a product out, if you want to get a solution out, I think it's much faster to get it out. Like for example, with this particular, patient, that and we have a few other patients, but the entire process, going through the FDA, getting the device, the surgery, the planning, these are like multi-year projects, right? These are like 5 years, 6 years, sometimes even 10 years in the pipeline. Like your Elon Musk Neuralink is the best example, right? So they've just published, starting to publish papers and showing demos, but they have been in the pipeline now for I think 5 6 years. I, don't- I think I think that's where now I'm trying to get a personal bias where I feel non-invasive BCIs, where you can actually target wide domains across the entire human population. You can actually solve those problems and get them out much faster. So I think that's where I see this going, and me personally also where I see myself going.
Right. I really hope that we, I mean, there is more push towards non-invasive BCI because, like you rightfully mentioned, I mean, when you're talking about invasive BCIs, I mean, though the the data that it captures is really really cool, but then nobody wants to have their skull drilled open. So I hope that there are these more push towards non-invasive BCIs, and through it which it helps patients. Is there any message that you would like to convey or send to these possibly millions billions of patients around the world who have like these motor cortex issues? What's your message to these patients and families?
Yeah, so it's I think it's a time to be optimistic, and I think mainly because there's so much coming out every single day. Every few months, a lot of things are coming out. So I think you can be extremely optimistic. I really hope that more companies now and come into the fray. I think that's going to be the key change. Where I feel right now we have enough basic knowledge from these research and academic institutes that really more companies should start coming out. There should be more funding for this. Investors need to be more excited by this. I think it's all trending in the positive direction. So, I think for patients who unfortunately have these type of paralysis issues, I think they have to be optimistic. And if they do some homework to see what is around in their country or their area, I think they might be surprised. There are a lot of companies who might be actually be looking for participants to test things out. I think one thing that I did not say is that for our participant, probably the biggest thing that we did for him was to give him a reason to come into work every single day. See, before this study started, now every single day, what is that person's motivation, right? They have to find things to do, people to interact with. It's a very, when you're constrained to your chair, it just life just becomes a little hard, and a lot of negative thoughts can come in. But if you have a sense of direction every single day, okay, maybe what I'm doing right now cannot immediately improve my life, but maybe in a few years' time, it can help me and everybody else in the world. Then suddenly you get motivation, right? So I think that's one thing that really stuck with me quite a bit, that every single day when we come in, even if we made only minor improvements, it was like the biggest thing in this person's life. Because on that day, they realized that they had made a tremendous improvement, not just for themselves and for others, and gave meaning to every single day. Every single day is almost like, yes, I have something to do. I have something to contribute. I'm just not, sitting in my chair, unable to do anything. So I think that mental health aspect is something that is really not spoken about enough. And I think that's something, you know, really we should do this more and more so that more um, patients have, tended reasons, right? And I'm sure their families and, day to day life gives them a lot of love and support. But on top of that, if they feel that every single day their life has meaning where they can contribute to humanity, I think that is like the biggest thing that can happen in the short term.
Right. Yeah. So there are these diseases in the world, I mean, but which I think obviously it's extremely draining. But then there are these, neurological disorders. I think it's the most draining for humans, and the entire family. And if there's a way to kind of, I mean, maybe reverse those things, I think what a fantastic world we would get into. And like you rightfully pointed out, there are these, I mean, your lab and there's various other labs and startups around the world who are kind of working at the cutting edge to, bring in these exoskeletons, these brain computer interfaces, and there's these stem cell research to kind of, reverse these disorders. And I hope all of these kind of comes together and converges, and we have more such products out there in the market, which is kind of accessible, for everyone, for every single patient in the world. If it kind of goes out, what a wonderful world that would be, where you are not dependent, you're not dependent on a wheelchair, you're not constrained to just a bed, you're able to, go about, move around and communicate. What a fantastic world that would be. uh, I'm sure there's a lot of these, I mean, listeners or researchers who would want to kind of dip in their feet into neuroscience or neural engineering. Is there any advice to, people who are listening, who would want to kind of, take this as a career? What would be your advice?
Yeah, so I think It's a good question. I think currently the way it stands, you know, in to get ahead, I think a little bit of advanced degrees might be required currently because the field is still in its very nascent stage. So there's a lot of discoveries that have to be made, and there's a lot of insights that we have to glean and methods that we have to improve on. So I think any young person who wants to enter this field, I would recommend just going in for some higher studies apart from doing the bachelor's, in either neuroscience, like somebody can study neuroscience or engineering and enter this field. It's interdisciplinary. It's always good to be specialized in something, but the way education is happening these days, it's not as rigid as it was 20 years ago, during my time when I was in college. Now things are much more interdisciplinary. Young people are encouraged to actually learn a lot of different concepts. But I think, given that being said, how young the field is, I would definitely encourage some level of higher studies, either a master's or a PhD, just to get that research experience. Uh, as the field matures more and more, you don't need that. For example, if you look at computer science, for example, pretty mature in terms of so many companies that have come out. So you can have a bachelor's and know coding and hit the ground running. So I think this field of neuroprosthetics still in its very nascent stages. So the more knowledge you have, actually, the better you can to push the field forward. And it's a great time to enter the field because we are so early. If you enter the field early, then 10, 15, 20 years down the line, you're very well positioned to be a leader, right? There's less rope you have to climb literally to get to the top. So I think that would be my advice. And, you know, if possible, get some internship experience or some startup experience, and that will help for sure. But I think for right now, at least the next 5, 10 years, little bit of advanced study would be required. And I think over time that will change. Once the field matures to a point, then most of the concepts will be taught at a much earlier stage. So then you can hit the ground running.
My last question, Doctor, will be great if you can elaborate the growing role of artificial intelligence in brain computer interface, from encoding to decoding these neural data, your moonshot, and paint a picture of what the world is going to look like in the next 10 years, with these brain computer interfaces, how it's going to impact society and specifically healthcare in the space that you are focusing, motor paralysis.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think AI is like crucial, right? I think the biggest jumps you have made on the software side over the past 10 years is only because the decoding algorithms with this deep learning AI, those have gotten better. And so with that, our results have also gotten better. Obviously there is a challenge because these AI models or deep learning models, they require tons of data. And that is a challenge for us because when we deal with human participants, there's a limit to how much data we can collect. Humans get tired. We're not machines. We cannot keep doing the same thing over and over for like days or weeks. So right now we are at this exciting phase where we're trying to come up with ways where, we can reduce the reliance of these AI models on big data. If we can, and so I think that's a very interesting subfield that we are operating in, where we take these AI models and say, okay, these AI models require tons of data. We don't have that. How do we overcome that limitation? So we actually come up with new designs of these existing AI models, and that obviously help decoding performance because they, are better. They're more complex models. It also helps us to learn how the brain works, right? So there is a push for us to learn how the brain works so that we can use AI more intelligently. So I think, that's a huge area that we are operating in, different from traditional AI researchers like OpenAI, for example, can feed the entire world internet data into their language models. So we are constrained. We cannot do something like that. So at least not now. Um, and I think the moonshot for me really would be if we can reduce calibration time for these BCIs down to like seconds, right? I think that would be a game changer, right? Even right now, even for stable performance, when we first plug somebody into the system, we do require like 10, 15 minutes calibration and then it becomes stable, right? But what if we have like, calibration on the order of like a few seconds? I think that would be, it really becomes plug and play, right? You do a surgery, you plug in the USB, few seconds, you're good to go and use the system, right? I think that would be true moonshot for me. And I think finally how the world is going to change. As I said, I think I'm a little bit more biased right now towards the non-invasive side. So I think in the immediate future, I think that's where we're going to see the most remarkable progress, right? So, I mean, it could be as simple as when I'm driving a car, I put on a BCI in the back of my head, which alerts me if I'm falling asleep, or which alerts me if, I'm not paying attention to certain side of the road. Like these are like, I think, ways to augment our own function using very small domains. I think that's going to come up very fast. Like this already exists for fighter pilots, you know. So I think why not use that for like people who are driving on the road, right? I think these are things that I feel like next 5, 10 years, the consumer side of non-invasive BCIs is going to like skyrocket. So I think that's what I'm like most excited about in ways that we possibly cannot imagine. Like even if we want to use an iPhone, like I think we can get to a point where you don't have to like physically pick it up and keep it here. We can think about very domain specific. Like I want to make a call. That's a very specific thought, right? So we can actually design a non-invasive BCI just for that. I want to make a call too. And that's it. You just make a call. You have your earpods in. I don't even have to interact with the phone. I'm just thinking and doing it. I feel like I think this is going to be the future. Perhaps.
Right, right. So, Doctor, really, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And kudos to all the work that you're doing, and wish you all the very best. And keep on pushing the boundaries. And I really hope that in the next 5 to 10 years, we have these. Maybe consumer devices which kind of helps not just normal people but also the ones who like really need it, who are bound to wheelchairs or crutches or beds. I hope that they are no longer bound to those devices but are free and are able to walk, interact. And like you mentioned, these consumer devices which I think are already there. There's Meta who's got like a neural band, with the AR glasses, and there are so many companies who are working on these virtual reality headsets, which is integrated within each device. And I'm sure, I think in the next 5 to 10 years or beyond, there's going to be more and more devices, which is going to be integrated with BCI, and which is going to like really shape the future, help us do so many things, and maybe possibly because the world is so today, I think there is like a digital overload of sort, and if it's able to like funnel things down, it helps us in a way, augments us in a way which is very beneficial for us, the entire society. I think what a fantastic world that would be. So really appreciate after taking time being part of the podcast. And the listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please hit the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye bye. Thank you, Doctor. Really
Any
appreciate this. Yeah.